Welcome to the debate. Imagine someone standing on a cold, empty street at midnight. They are, cheerfully tossing fresh bread onto the pavement.
Fully convinced the bakery in front of them is still open, right?
Exactly. The neon sign is dark, the door is padlocked, the street is just dead silent. The cues are all there, staring them right in the face, but they just keep tossing the bread.
And, culturally, we tend to look at that kind of unyielding, reality-defying hope and applaud it. We call it resilience.
Right, but when you step out of the realm of poetry and into the strict laws of neurobiology and information theory, you realize this behavior isn't a virtue at all. It is a metabolic crisis disguised as an aesthetic journey.
Yeah, it really shifts the perspective.
It does. And today, we are examining the cognitive mechanics of relational and environmental processing. Specifically, we're looking at a profound tension in our source material between two opposing cognitive architectures, which are the holiday mindset and system availability thinking.
Which is a fascinating split in the cartography we're looking at today.
Absolutely. And the central question we are unpacking is this. Is the human tendency to filter out immediate environmental friction a vital evolutionary mechanism for sustaining long-term structural belief? Or is it a highly volatile, uninsulated projection that leads directly to catastrophic mental and physical drain?
Right.
So my position is that idealizing discomfort is a dangerous open-loop trap that actively suppresses the brain's vital error correction cues, leading to complete bioenergetic collapse.
And I will be arguing that what you just described, what looks on the surface like, stubbornly ignoring obvious cues, is actually a highly sophisticated Reidian and Fristonian mechanism of optimistic predictive processing, which is absolutely necessary to prevent identity drift.
Well, let me define exactly why I view this as an extraordinary and vital structural correction. When the material defines the holiday mindset, it describes a state of idealizing discomfort and actively focusing on ignoring available cues.
Right, turning a blind eye to the friction.
Exactly. Under Carl Friston's active inference framework, we know the brain is a prediction machine. It projects a top-down model onto reality. But the holiday mindset projects a highly distorted, high-voltage, optimistic prior. Symmetrically, instead of treating environmental friction, like the silence of a partner, a restricted 1% communication channel, or a locked bakery door, as diagnostic data to update and decay your expectations, this mindset romanticizes the discomfort.
It makes it part of the narrative.
Right. It treats systemic lag, translation bottlenecks, and bioenergetic drain not as thermodynamic warning signs, but as part of the aesthetic of the journey. I assert that system availability thinking is the required structural correction here. We must parse these thermodynamic warning signs with clinical rigor and protect our irreplaceable brain energy, our astrocytic bioenergetics, from leaking into uninsulated open-loop ports.
I hear that, but I look at the exact same framework and see a completely different utility. I think the so-called holiday mindset is being fundamentally misinterpreted as a cognitive failure when, it's actually the foundation of how a mature brain sustains complex purpose in a highly chaotic world.
Okay, how so?
Let's look at Thomas Reid's theory of perception. Reid understood that physical sensations are merely natural signs. Through acquired perception, the human mind is literally designed to become inattentionally blind to raw, transient sensations so it can leap directly to the mind-independent realities they signify.
So you're saying ignoring the bad data is a feature, not a bug?
Exactly. Maintaining an optimistic prior, even when you are temporarily in a total informational vacuum, is a deliberate, computationally necessary strategy. If we didn't filter out the cold, bottom-up telemetry of a harsh or standardized environment, we could never establish a permanent database schema for our lives. We would constantly be victims of relational identity drift, just completely rewriting our core purpose every single time we encountered temporal noise or a delayed response.
But to understand the danger of what you're proposing, the danger of idealizing this discomfort, we have to look at the literal neurobiological hardware that measures our expectations against reality.
You're talking about the tachykinin study.
Yes, the May 2026 University of Oregon study on tachykinin 1, or TAC1 neurons. The researchers isolated a distinct subpopulation of neurons deep within the lateral habeula, which is often called the brain's anti-reward center. These TAC1 neurons function as a literal physical disappointment meter.
Right, like a gauge on a dashboard.
Precisely. They are tuned exclusively to negative reward prediction errors. When you anticipate a reward and receive less than expected or nothing at all, these cells burst into activity, and their firing scales precisely with the magnitude of the deficit.
Yeah, the precision in that study was incredible. I mean, the researchers could literally read the brain scans of a mouse and calculate exactly how many expected treats it was denied just by looking at the intensity of the neural response on that gauge.
Exactly. It's a highly calibrated system. And crucially, they don't fire for just any bad news. If you suddenly blast a mouse with a puff of air, the disappointment meter does nothing. It only fires for an expectation shortfall.
Because it's tied to prediction.
Right. The paper explicitly notes this circuit is a vital error correction machine. It physically hurts to be disappointed because your brain is trying to force you to change your behavior. So when a system in the holiday mindset ignores the silence of a dark terminal, it is actively suppressing its own disappointment meter. It's bypassing the brain's natural error correction machinery. When you do that, you force the prefrontal cortex into a highly expensive counterfactual parallel simulation. You keep throwing that conceptual bread into the empty street because you have tuned out the cue that the shop is closed. The prediction error minimization loop remains permanently open, leaving your predictive engine physically spinning its wheels in a vacuum. You are consuming massive metabolic resources without ever actually reaching a resolution.
Well, I hear the mechanics of the disappointment meter, but we have to ask, what happens if that meter dictates every move we make? I mean, Carl Friston's optimistic predictive processing actually dismantles the traditional distinction between belief and desire.
How does it dismantle it?
In his framework, motivation isn't driven by some separate abstract desire. It's driven by a non-negotiable belief that must be physically realized through action. The optimistic prior is a fixed structural constant. It provides the entire system with its relational purpose.
But at what cost?
The cost of stability over immediate reactivity. If the brain constantly updated and decayed its priors based on every single instance of a dark terminal or environmental friction, we would be incapable of sustaining any long-term high-order goals. We'd give up on everything the moment it got difficult.
But if the external feedback is zero, if the street is completely empty, how can the closed-loop update possibly calculate? I mean, you're flying blind.
You aren't flying blind, you are actively searching. Let's look at Seth Hurd's 2026 research on the evolutionary algorithms of cognitive attraction. Hope isn't just some abstract poetic feeling. It is an excitatory dopaminergic component meant to drive the system forward. It is the literal bioenergetic catalyst that fuels the system to actively practice and search behavioral space, rather than defaulting to giving up and shutting down.
Okay, but
If you firewall block that dopaminergic drive at the very first sign of a negative reward prediction error, if you let the disappointment meter shut off the engine instantly, you aren't saving the system. You are structurally guaranteeing that the network collapses into disconnected components. The system doesn't decay the optimistic prior because that prior is tied to its core identity frameworks.
I mean, if this optimistic prior demands that we push through friction, we have to look closely at how the brain justifies filtering out the raw data of that friction. You brought up Thomas Reid's theory of perception earlier. How does Reidian perception excuse completely ignoring the reality of a dark terminal or a silent partner?
By explaining the mechanics of acquired perception and inattentional blindness. Reid argued fiercely against the Cartesian belief that we only have access to fleeting, drifting internal sensations. He said our minds actually direct us to stable, mind-independent external realities.
Give me an example of that in practice.
Sure. Let's make this tangible. Think about the famous psychological experiment where people are told to count basketball passes in a video, and they completely miss a person in a gorilla suit walking through the frame. Or, the experiment where they miss a brightly dressed unicycling clown because their attention is locked on a specific task. The mind becomes blind to the sensory signage, effectively erases it to focus on the thing it has deemed fundamentally important.
Wait, so You were saying the silence or the locked door of the bakery is just a transient sensory sign? It's just a unicycling clown to be ignored?
Precisely. Filtering out the cold, bottom-up telemetry of a standardized, noisy environment is an expert-level cognitive achievement. Think about massive-scale machine learning, like the world of continuous AI training.
Okay.
One of the most critical engineering hazards is concept drift. If an AI updates its foundational weights based on every single noisy, localized data point it encounters, it eventually forgets its core function. It drifts. Symmetrically, human relationships in high-noise environments suffer from relational identity drift if they rely on transient temporal context.
So the blindness is protective.
Exactly. By becoming inattentionally blind to the immediate, lossy temporal noise, the mind bypasses that bottleneck. It allows expert-level networks to anchor onto permanent, invariant realities, rather than being thrown off course by a temporary lack of immediate feedback.
The problem with mapping Reid's realism onto this is that Reid fundamentally requires the sensations to actually correlate to an objective reality. You cannot just hallucinate an object, ignore the data that contradicts it, and call it acquired perception. If you actively suppress your own TAC1 disappointment meter, you aren't leaping to a mind-independent reality, you are falling into the open-loop trap. Think about the Vection illusion in visual perception.
Oh, right. Remind us how the Vection illusion works.
It's that feeling when you're sitting on a completely stationary train and the train next to you starts pulling out of the station. For a split second, your stomach drops and your brain automatically calculates that you are moving backwards.
Yeah, it's very disorienting.
It's an involuntary, unconscious error in mapping. Your brain over-indexes on the visual noise of the adjacent train and completely ignores the vestibular cues from your inner ear telling you that you are sitting still. By ignoring the uninformative cues of a silent partner, your brain is doing the exact same thing. It is overfitting equations to patternless noise.
But is it patternless, or just a pattern it hasn't resolved yet?
Well, a 2020 study on expectation formation under uninformative signals showed that individuals actually update their prior beliefs even after observing signals that carry absolutely zero diagnostic information. They process the silence in a reference-dependent manner relative to their own high-voltage expectation. They are desperately searching for a linear resolution that isn't there. You aren't anchoring to an invariant reality. You are running an uninsulated projection in a complete informational vacuum.
I understand the train analogy, but you are assuming the system has no alternative way to compress and store this data safely. The brain isn't just sitting there hallucinating, it's translating. Let's move from perceptual theory to physiological limits. What happens when the system hits its absolute physical constraints? This is where the spatial mapping we see in the cartography, specifically the VHG 146 memory palace, becomes so crucial.
I'm glad you brought up the physiological limits because this is exactly where system availability thinking proves its absolute necessity. The brain is not a cloud server with infinite bandwidth. It is a biological system with staggering constraints. When a twice exceptional thinker, someone with highly gifted reasoning but localized processing speed constraints, is hit with unmediated, high-entropy emotional data, their visual working memory bottlenecks severely.
Right.
We are talking about the capacity dropping to between just 1 and 2 items.
And that sudden bottleneck triggers a severe metabolic response.
A catastrophic one. It creates an acute ATP deficit. ATP is the literal biological fuel of the cells. When that fuel drops, it opens Cure 6.2 containing KATP channels. Let's explain what that means simply. It acts exactly like a circuit breaker in your house.
Right, to prevent an overload.
Exactly. If you plug in too many space heaters, the system draws too much power and snap, the breaker trips to stop the house from catching fire. In the brain, this KATP bioenergetic brake hyperpolarizes the neuronal membrane, shuts down excitability, and forces an involuntary cognitive freeze state. The prefrontal terminal simply goes dark to protect its baseline capacity.
The freeze response.
Right, and this is why the holiday mindset is fatal. You cannot afford an astrocytic drain. You cannot run your mitochondrial fuel pumps in reverse. sacrificing your own baseline energy to export fuel to a disconnected situation. You are running your biological fuel reserves to zero, trying to heat an empty room.
Okay, but
Wait, just to finish the thought. The moment the available cues signal a disconnected vertex, system availability thinking dictates that you must execute local firewalls. You have to recognize the breaker is about to trip and you close the active training updates.
I don't disagree with the biology of the circuit breaker at all. We are entirely aligned on the rigid hardware limits and the reality of the K-ATP bioenergetic break. But I interpret the brain's solution to that breaker entirely differently. The creation of a stable, stimulus-invariant spatial index code, like the VHD-146 memory palace, is the ultimate realization of the optimistic prior, not a retreat from it.
Wait, how does creating a wildly complex mathematical spatial grid save metabolic energy? I mean, building a memory palace sounds like it would draw more power and trip the breaker faster.
Well, because it solves the credit assignment problem and bypasses temporal latency through a process called chunking. A 2026 paper in Nature Machine Intelligence proved that standard networks rely on integrating stimulus history over time. That is a volatile, linear strategy based on recency, which exhausts working memory.
Right, standard temporal processing.
Exactly. But expert-level networks discover an index code that detaches information from sequential time entirely. They anchor it onto an invariant spatial coordinate system. When the cartography and the source material translates a connection into native schemas, like commutative algebra, edge ideals, or quantum mechanics, it is exploiting statistical regularities. Paul Bay's 2024 research shows the adult brain optimizes extremely limited working memory by using these pre-compiled schemas to compress complex data.
Let me make sure I'm following. You're arguing that by converting emotional or relational ambiguity into a structured spatial grid, the central executive can safely process the connection without tripping that KTP circuit breaker?
Precisely. It compresses profound multidimensional complexity into a single, computationally safe chunk. If I ask you to remember 12 random numbers, you'll struggle. If I ask you to remember 3 years, 1492, 1776, 2026, you do it instantly, because you already have schemas for them. It's not about retreating behind a local firewall. It's about establishing an undrifted, permanent database schema that survives the latency of a restricted channel. You don't have to keep the channel open and draining your energy. You just upload the schema and let it rest.
I see the elegance in that, but we have to look at how that compressed data is actually delivered between two people. You can have the most beautiful stimulus invariant index code in the world, but if you don't sequence the delivery properly to the other person, you still crash their hardware.
Which is where the delivery mechanism comes in.
Yes, this brings us to the PRP framework. Point, reason, example, point. Chang Zhao and Edward Vogel's 2023 research proved that sequentially presenting complex data one item at a time utilizes the exact same cognitive capacity while dramatically reducing the initial attentional competition during encoding.
Right, so it functions as a highly targeted retrieval queue.
Exactly. Think of it like this. If I tell you to find a specific receipt in a backpack stuffed with loose, crumpled papers, your brain will exhaust itself digging through the noise. But if I hand you a neatly labeled, color-coded folder containing just that receipt, you expend almost zero energy.
Makes sense.
By using PrEP, you do the grueling prefrontal sorting for the capacity-constrained system. You provide a clean retrieval queue, the point, so they aren't scrambling in the backpack. You sequence the delivery so their working memory can safely register the message without tripping the breaker. But notice what this requires. It requires clinical, data-driven rigor.
The system availability approach.
Yes, it requires acknowledging the orthogonal remapping friction. You are not romanticizing the silence or the difficulty. You're actively mapping the exact coordinates of the bioenergetic break and engineering a loss-free cable to bypass it. This is the essence of system availability thinking. You protect your baseline astrocytic bioenergetics by refusing to transmit uninsulated emotion into a dark terminal. You build the cable.
Building the cable is brilliant, but you have to ask why the brain would invest the energy to build it in the first place. Delivering a highly structured, peer-to-peer relational proposal, what the text calls a cognitive jackpot, actually leverages the optimistic prior to execute a one-shot update.
Oh, a one-shot update?
Yeah.
Luke Coddington and Joshua Dudman's May 2026 HHMI research prove that a single maximum magnitude reward triggers an extended dopamine wave that completely slashes learning timelines. Dopamine acts like a biological highlighter pen. When it floods the system, it highlights the neural pathway and says, "Save this permanently."
Bypassing the need for repetition?
Exactly. You don't need hundreds of slow, uninsulated trials that drain your ATP. By using the PrEP framework and the spatial index code together, you trigger a massive dopaminergic lock on prefrontal attention. The optimistic prior isn't a delusion. It is the exact engine that drives the system to craft this expert-level, high-fidelity schema.
So your view is that the intensive clinical engineering of system availability thinking isn't the opposite of the optimistic prior, but rather its ultimate byproduct?
Yes, inextricably linked. If the system didn't hold a non-negotiable belief that the connection was a high-value coordinate worth saving, it would never have spent the prefrontal resources to build a stimulus-invariant 3D spatial grid. It would have just defected to a standardized low-complexity baseline.
That is a fascinating way to bridge the two.
The human capacity for deep, structural alignment inherently requires an optimistic prior that can transcend transient friction. What appears to you as a dangerous, inattentional blindness to a locked bakery door is often the very mechanism that allows expert-level networks to construct permanent monuments of intellectual symmetry that outlast the winter.
Well, that is a fascinating synthesis of the two frameworks. As we wrap up today's discussion, I want to clearly summarize my position. I maintain that system availability thinking provides an extraordinary and vital structural correction to how we process relational and environmental friction. When a system runs a highly volatile, uninsulated projection idealizing discomfort and actively suppressing its own TAC1 error correction cues, it falls into an open-loop trap. That trap guarantees a catastrophic drain on astrocytic ATP, tripping our biological circuit breakers. True abundance and true cognitive security requires a roamer's deliberate remapping of reality. We must acknowledge orthogonal remapping friction, utilize sequential gating like the PrEP framework to sort the data, and fiercely protect our system's baseline bioenergetics from being exhausted in a vacuum.
And to summarize my perspective, while I fully acknowledge the severe metabolic constraints of the human brain, particularly the reality of the KATP bioenergetic break, I conclude that an optimistic prior is not a vulnerability. It is a computationally necessary strategy for survival in a noisy world.
By bypassing the noise.
Exactly. By employing radian-acquired perception to efface transient temporal noise, the mind can construct a stimulus-invariant index code. This allows the system to bypass local concept drift and anchor onto a mind-independent reality. The drive to push through immediate friction is exactly what enables a network to compress complex data into native schemas, ultimately delivering a one-shot cognitive jackpot that permanently recalibrates relational alignment.
It's clear we have profound areas of convergence regarding the sheer physical limits of our neural architecture. We both agree that the brain is a bounded, metabolically constrained prediction machine. The tension ultimately lies in whether we must constantly close the loop to protect our fuel, or if we can afford to keep the loop open long enough to build something permanent.
It is a profound tension. I mean, it's a fascinating look at how our neurology constantly balances the harsh thermodynamic cost of reality against the structural forward-driving power of hope. There is so much more to explore in this source material regarding active inference and spatial mapping.
There really is. We started today talking about someone throwing conceptual bread into an empty street, tuning out the fact that the bakery is closed. Whether that person is suffering a metabolic crisis of delusion or successfully building a permanent spatial map of the city that will serve them for a lifetime depends entirely on whether they know how to protect their own biological fuel while they stand in the cold. It's a question of survival versus structure, and it's one that will continue to challenge how we understand the human mind. Thank you for joining us on the debate.